Hi guys. So normally on weekends I like to do Saturday morning reviews where I put up some kind of a book review or book chat, and that's not exactly what this video is today. It's more of kind of a fangirling video of me trying to convince a bunch of you to read Fullmetal Alchemist. Fullmetal Alchemist is a manga series that actually has an anime that goes with it. It actually has two animes, and the reason is the first anime that came out, if I'm not mistaken, ran into kind of a Game of Thrones incident where the show, I believe, kind of got ahead of the manga, so it started off almost exactly the same, but then at one point kind of strayed. However, the second anime that came out, Fullmetal Alchemist Brotherhood, which you can find on Netflix, does follow the series almost exactly, with a tiny few exceptions here and there, just a few things left out, or maybe a tiny bit of things amplified, but it's essentially exactly the same. My husband has watched all of Fullmetal Alchemist Brotherhood and read all of the mangas, whereas I have watched all of the anime and then read some of the mangas, but that's how I know that it stays almost exactly the same. And I'm currently making my way through the manga, and it's just so good. But I wanted to kind of throw that out there. He did start with the manga and then watch the show, and I started with the show and now I'm reading the manga. And for those of you who've watched my channel before, you know that my husband is a big comic book reader, but he also reads a fair amount of manga. He's definitely getting way more into it as of late, and I think a lot of times when somebody is used to reading that kind of stuff, you assume that they're going to be able to get into it easily, but if you're used to reading regular books, just like chapter books, if you will, when you're used to reading that, you feel like sometimes manga and comics can be a little daunting, and it's just so not what you're used to, and so you feel like it's difficult to get into. And if you feel that way, getting into the anime first could be a really good option. I can't exactly say which is better because I did watch the show first, and it's definitely revealed everything that's going to happen in the manga, but the manga is still fantastic. Really quick though, I am going to kind of interrupt myself and let you all know what the series is about. I have mentioned it before, but if you're new or if you've just never heard me talk about it, it follows these two brothers, Edward and Alphonse, who lost their mother at a very young age, and they tried to use alchemy to get her back, but it went terribly, terribly wrong, and one brother lost an arm and a leg, and the other brother's soul had to be attached to a body of armor. These two brothers are now out to try and get the original bodies back. At the beginning of the series, they're searching for the Philosopher's Stone because they've heard that this stone is going to be able to give them what they need, and it's going to be able to restore them. And so they're set out to try and find this, but they are definitely caught up in a lot of other things that are going on with the military and with a lot of other people kind of behind the scenes. This actually leads into a lot of fantastic political intrigue, which I definitely wasn't expecting when I got into this story. We also have an amazing cast of characters. I say that pretty much every single time I talk about Fullmetal Alchemist because I actually really love the two main characters, the two brothers, and they are younger protagonists, but I wouldn't say it's a younger story necessarily. There's definitely some really heavy themes, and there's some really dark things that happen. Nothing overly explicit though, so it's not like you're going into it and you're gonna have to worry about really intense blood and violence or something like that. It's not quite like that, but the themes are dark and some of the things that happen are quite tragic. But through it all, we have these two brothers who are extremely likable and very flawed, and you get to watch them grow, and you get to see them here and there they have some issues with each other, but for the most part they have a great sibling bond. So for those of you that are really into sibling bonds in stories, this is one of the best, if not the best, sibling bond I've ever seen. And I normally don't really care for young protagonists, and these two are quite young when the story starts off. The older of the two brothers is only 15, and generally speaking, I find that authors seem to think all young people, as far as people who are writing for older audiences, they always write the young people kind of stupid. They're so unlikable, and you're like, can we just get to the grown-ups now? It's not like that at all. The author does an amazing job of combining the youthfulness that you would find, of course, in younger characters, and showing the kinds of struggles that they're going through in the sort of coming-of-age type way, but also just making them really great characters. You think of them as people. You don't think of them as kids. You're not waiting to get around to the grown-ups and get around to the cool stuff. Their story is great. They're amazing characters. And then, of course, on top of that, lots of other amazing characters are present. Recently for Halloween, I made a video about some of my favorite villains, and I honestly could have made most of my list characters from this series because good or bad, the writer writes amazing characters, and the bad guys have a variety of badness to them. That's a terrible way to put it, sorry. There are varying levels of antagonists in this. Some of them are more like anti-heroes, and in fact the one I mentioned in my favorite villains is probably more accurately an anti-hero, where some of the other characters go as far as being the big bad guy and are as bad as you get, but you have such a range that you never get annoyed, I would say, because you're like, oh, that one, darn it, that one's like the worst, and then you get to another one, you're like, oh, this one's kind of cool though. The same could be said of our heroes as well. You have some of them who are just little sweethearts, and they're as amazing and kind as can be, and then you have other ones that maybe some of their motivations are a little selfish, but at the same time, they're not necessarily bad motivations. And sometimes these motivations don't necessarily align with other characters' motivations, regardless of whether they're all good or not. So you have good guys that are kind of getting in each other's way, and then on top of that, you got the bad guys that come in and F everything up. But regardless, a lot of the times you get really interesting pairings as the series continues of people that have to work together, whether they're good or bad, and they have to kind of come together to get out of certain situations or everybody's gonna die. And I just love seeing that in stories when the good guys and bad guys have to kind of put their own personal stuff aside and be like, well, if we don't all want to die, we're gonna have to band together a little. When I talk about this series, I also always talk about the fact that it is incredibly emotional. It is hilarious and really tragic at times. It's crazy that it has such a range. The only other story that I think is comparable, and it's not even a book, but would be Final Fantasy X, for those of you who have played that video game. That video game is heartbreaking, oh my gosh, and really terrible things happen and people die and it's sad, but at the same time, there's some like really goofy humor in it. I'm not sure how many of you are able to associate Final Fantasy X and this together. I don't know how many of you are fans of that game, but that game's amazing. If you haven't played it, you should. But the amount of emotions that are evoked when reading this, most of the time it's funny. There's a lot of humor. I think the author is actually really funny, and she has a really interesting sense of humor sometimes, but then she writes some stuff that is so sad, and books don't make me cry. I don't know what it is, but I've just never cried from a book before. But I was sitting reading this one scene that I knew was coming because I've seen the anime. I knew the scene was coming, and then I got to it and I was like, I was reading it at Barnes & Noble, and I was like, keep it together, keep it together. I do want to note something about the way the paneling works and the whole reading the opposite direction than what we're used to. It does read from right to left instead of left to right, but it wasn't difficult for me to get into at all. I didn't find that, it wasn't difficult. So if you're nervous about that, don't be. But I wanted to mention something that I thought was really cool about the paneling and about the art in this. First off, the art is great, but it's simplistic. And so there's something about that, it just makes it easy to like look at. I don't know if that makes any sense, but you know who everybody is, even though the art style isn't really detailed. You can always tell who's who. But what I love is that somehow she does it without it being confusing, but she will have one person talking, but the panel will be showing a different character. And that panel, I'm never like, wait, who's talking? I'm confused. She does it in a way that's not confusing, but what I really like is you get to see the other characters' reactions to what are being said. Anyway, I think Fullmetal Alchemist is absolutely amazing. It is one of my favorite stories of all time. The more I think about it, the more I like it, the more I get into it, the more I like it. And I just think not enough people talk about it. I want more people to know that it exists and more people to give it a shot, whether they're manga readers or not. I think if you're gonna give it a shot, try to at least read, if you get a hold of these older bind-ups, try to read 1 through 6, because I think enough happens in those that you get a taste for the humor, a taste for the action, and a taste for the tragic moments. All that said, if you've read Fullmetal Alchemist and you also really love it, or if you've watched Fullmetal Alchemist Brotherhood and you love that, show your love in the comment section. Let people know how amazing this series is. That's it though. Thanks so much for watching. Thanks for letting me fangirl with you all for however long this ends up being, and have a great rest of your day. Bye.